German Shepherd recognizes woman standing in front of him and starts to cry. The ending is shocking. Claire Matthews hadn't planned on visiting the adoption fair that Saturday morning. In fact, she'd driven past the colorful banners and cheerful crowd 3 times before finally pulling into the parking lot of Wilson Community Park. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned off the ignition, and she caught a glimpse of herself in the rearview mirror, exhausted brown eyes staring back, dark circles underneath telling the story of another sleepless night. "Just a quick look," she whispered to herself, though her heart raced with an inexplicable urgency. After 10 years of living alone, her therapist had suggested that a pet might help with the healing process. Claire had dismissed the idea initially. How could a pet possibly fill the void left by her missing son? The autumn air carried the sound of barking and excited chatter as she approached the fair. Volunteers in bright yellow vests bustled about, leading dogs of all sizes on leashes while potential adopters crouched to offer treats and affection. Claire hugged her worn denim jacket closer, suddenly feeling out of place among the smiling faces and wagging tails. "First time at an adoption event?" A cheerful voice startled her. A young volunteer with a nameplate reading Sarah appeared at her side, clipboard in hand. Claire nodded, managing a small smile. "That obvious, huh? We all start somewhere. Are you looking for any particular type of dog?" Sarah's enthusiasm was infectious, and Claire felt her shoulders relaxing slightly. "I'm not sure," Claire admitted. "Something calm, maybe? I live alone, and I work from home as a graphic designer, so—" She stopped mid-sentence, her attention caught by a commotion near the back of the adoption area. A large German Shepherd had suddenly stood up in his kennel, ears perked forward, body rigid with attention. Even from a distance, Claire could see his intense focus, and it was directed straight at her. The dog's behavior had drawn the attention of nearby volunteers, who exchanged confused glances. "That's strange," Sarah murmured, following Claire's gaze. "That's Max. He's usually quite reserved. We've had him for about 3 months, and he barely reacts to visitors." As Claire took a step closer, the German Shepherd's demeanor changed dramatically. He began to whimper, soft at first, then building to an almost human-like cry. His paws scratched at the kennel door with increasing urgency, his whole body trembling with emotion. "I've never seen anything like this," another volunteer commented, rushing over to check on the dog. "He's never acted this way before." Claire found herself drawn forward, her feet moving of their own accord. With each step she took, the dog's cries grew more intense, more desperate. There was something about his eyes, a deep, knowing intelligence that sent chills down her spine. She knelt before the kennel, and the German Shepherd pressed himself against the gate, trying to reach her through the bars. "May I?" Claire asked, gesturing to the latch. The volunteers exchanged glances before Sarah nodded, moving to help open the kennel door. The moment the gate swung open, the dog approached Claire with a gentleness that contradicted his previous urgency. He pressed his nose into her hands, inhaling deeply, his whole body shuddering with emotion. Then, to everyone's surprise, he began to lick her face while making soft whimpering sounds, almost as if he was crying. "This is incredible," Sarah whispered, watching the interaction. "It's like he knows you." Claire's hands trembled as they sank into the dog's thick fur. Something about this felt so familiar, yet impossible. She'd never owned a dog, had never even considered it after Daniel. But this connection, this immediate bond, it felt like. "What's his background?" Claire asked, her voice hardly more than a whisper as the German Shepherd pressed his head against her chest, his whimpers now soft and continuous. Sarah consulted her clipboard, flipping through several pages. "He was found as a stray about 3 months ago, pretty far from here actually. Near the old industrial district in Millbrook." She paused, noting Claire's sudden stillness. "Is something wrong?" Claire's heart had stopped for a moment. Millbrook. The same area where Daniel had disappeared 10 years ago. It couldn't be a coincidence, could it? She looked into the dog's eyes again, and this time, something flickered in her memory. A half-forgotten dream, perhaps, or... "How old do you think he is?" Claire asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The vet estimates around 10 or 11 years, Sarah replied. He's in great shape for his age, though. Whoever had him before took good care of him, at least initially. It's a mystery why he ended up as a stray. 10 years. The number echoed in Claire's mind like a bell toll. She studied the dog's face more carefully now, noting the gray starting to show around his muzzle, the wisdom in his dark eyes. He met her gaze steadily, and in that moment Claire felt as though she was looking into the eyes of an old soul who carried secrets she needed to uncover. I'll take him, Claire said suddenly, surprising herself as much as the volunteers. I want to adopt him. Sarah's eyebrows shot up. Are you sure? We usually encourage people to think it over, maybe come back for a few visits first. But Claire knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that this dog was meant to come home with her. As if reading her thoughts, the German shepherd pressed closer, his tail wagging slowly, those intelligent eyes never leaving her face. I'm sure, Claire said firmly, even as her mind raced with questions. Why did this dog seem to recognize her? What was the connection to Millbrook? And why couldn't she shake the feeling that this meeting was more than just chance, that it was somehow connected to the tragedy that had torn her life apart a decade ago? As Sarah left to get the adoption paperwork, Claire leaned close to the dog, whispering words she hadn't dared speak aloud in years. You know something, don't you? Something about my Daniel? The German shepherd's response was subtle but unmistakable. A single tear rolled down his furry cheek as he pressed his nose against her heart. The drive home felt surreal. Claire kept glancing in the rearview mirror, where Max sat perfectly still in the back seat, his eyes meeting hers every time she looked. He wasn't acting like a dog who had just been adopted. There was no excited panting, no curious sniffing of his new surroundings. Instead, he maintained an almost watchful presence, as if he were guarding her. The autumn leaves swirled across the driveway as Claire pulled up to her modest two-story house. She had never moved after Daniel's disappearance, despite everyone's suggestions that a fresh start might help. Something had always held her back, a stubborn hope that one day her son might find his way home. Well, this is it, Claire said, her voice breaking the silence as she opened the car door. Max stepped out with deliberate grace, his paws touching the concrete as if he were remembering something. He paused, nose twitching, and then did something that made Claire's breath catch in her throat. He walked directly to the worn welcome mat, sat down, and waited expectantly. How did you? Claire's voice trailed off. This was exactly where Daniel used to wait for her to unlock the door after school. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the keys, trying to dismiss the eerie coincidence. The moment the door swung open, Max's behavior became even more peculiar. Instead of exploring his new environment like a normal dog would, he walked through the house with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. He paused briefly in the living room, his eyes fixed on the wall where family photos hung, specifically, on a picture of Daniel taken just weeks before his disappearance. Claire watched, transfixed, as Max approached the photo wall. He rose on his hind legs, gently touching his nose to the frame that held Daniel's smiling face. A soft whimper escaped him, and when he turned to look at Claire, she could have sworn she saw recognition in his eyes. This is impossible, Claire whispered, crossing the room to stand beside him. You couldn't have known him. You couldn't have been there. But even as she spoke the words, doubt crept into her mind. The timing matched. Max was estimated to be around 10 years old, which meant he would have been just a puppy when Daniel disappeared. Lost in thought, Claire almost didn't notice Max leaving the room. The click of his nails on the hardwood floor drew her attention, and she followed him upstairs. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw where he was heading, Daniel's bedroom. The door had remained closed for the past decade, preserving everything exactly as it had been on that last morning. Max sat in front of the door, looking back at Claire with an intensity that made her shiver. After a moment's hesitation, she reached for the doorknob. The room beyond was frozen in time, model airplanes hanging from the ceiling, superhero posters on the walls, and a twin bed with Star Wars sheets that hadn't been slept in for 10 years. But Max's reaction to the room was what truly shook Claire to her core. Instead of entering, he backed away, his ears flattened against his head. A low growl rumbled in his throat as he stared at the window, the same window that police had found partially open during their investigation, with no signs of forced entry. "You're trying to tell me something, aren't you?" Claire knelt beside Max, her hand resting on his back. She could feel him trembling. "Were you there that night? Did you see what happened to my boy?" Max turned to her, pressing his forehead against her shoulder in an almost human gesture of comfort. Then, unexpectedly, he pulled away and trotted down the hallway to the master bedroom. Claire followed, watching as he approached her bedside table where she kept her most precious possession, Daniel's favorite stuffed animal, a worn teddy bear named Mr. Buttons. With gentle care, Max picked up the teddy bear in his mouth and brought it to Claire. As she took it from him, something fell from behind the bear, a small, folded piece of paper that had been tucked into Mr. Buttons' worn seam. Claire's hands shook as she unfolded it, revealing a child's drawing she had never seen before. The crayon sketch showed a stick figure of a boy, a brown dog, and what appeared to be a house with a red door. In the corner, in Daniel's messy handwriting, were the words, "My secret friend Max." The date on the drawing was just 2 days before Daniel disappeared. Claire sank to the floor, the paper clutched to her chest. "He knew you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "All this time, I thought he was making up an imaginary friend, but he was talking about you, wasn't he? You were really there." Max placed his paw on her knee, his eyes filled with an intelligence that seemed to transcend his canine nature. In that moment, Claire realized that this wasn't just a random adoption or a strange coincidence. This was the first real clue she'd had in 10 years about what happened to her son. As if confirming her thoughts, Max suddenly tensed, his attention drawn to something outside the window. Claire followed his gaze just in time to see a figure quickly duck out of sight. Someone had been watching them. By the time she rushed to the window, the street below was empty, but a chill ran down her spine as she noticed something on the sidewalk, fresh muddy footprints leading away from her house, and beside them, the distinct impression of an old-fashioned key that someone had dropped and hastily snatched up in their hurry to flee. Max's low growl beside her carried a clear message. Whatever mystery had brought them together was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning to unravel, and somewhere in this dog's memories lay the truth about what happened to Daniel on that autumn night 10 years ago. Sleep eluded Claire that night. Every time she closed her eyes, her mind replayed the day's events, Max's emotional recognition at the shelter, his strange familiarity with her house, and most disturbing of all, the mysterious figure outside her window. Max hadn't left her side since the incident, positioning himself vigilantly by her bedroom door, his ears perking up at every sound. Around midnight, a distant thunder rolled across the sky, and rain began to patter against the windows. Claire was about to attempt sleep again when Max suddenly stood up, his body rigid with attention. Before she could react, he darted downstairs, his nails clicking urgently against the hardwood floors. "Max?" Claire called, hurrying after him. She found him in the kitchen, pawing at the back door that led to the yard. His behavior was different now, not fearful, but determined. "You need to go out?" The moment she opened the door, Max bounded into the rain-soaked darkness. Claire grabbed her raincoat and followed, watching in confusion as he made his way to a specific corner of the backyard, near the old oak tree where Daniel's tire swing still hung, swaying gently in the storm. Max began to dig with purpose, his powerful paws cutting through the wet earth. Claire's first instinct was to stop him. She'd always kept the yard pristine, hoping that somehow maintaining everything exactly as it had been would help bring Daniel back. But something in Max's intensity made her hesitate. After several minutes of frantic digging, his paw struck something solid. Claire knelt beside him, heedless of the mud soaking through her pajama pants, and reached into the hole. Her fingers closed around a small metal box, its surface corroded by years underground. With trembling hands, Claire carried the box to the covered patio, Max following closely. The lock was rusted through, and it took only a gentle twist to break it open. Inside, protected by a plastic bag, she found items that made her heart stop: a small notebook with Daniel's name on it, a set of photographs, and most significantly, a rusted key that matched the impression she'd seen in the mud earlier that day. "Oh my God!" Claire whispered, opening the notebook with shaking fingers. The first page bore Daniel's distinctive childish scrawl. Dear Max. Mr. Tom says I shouldn't tell Mom about you yet. He says it's our special secret, just like the clubhouse he's building. But you're my best friend, and I want to keep our memories safe. That's why I'm hiding this box. If anything happens, you'll know where to find it. Asterisk. Claire's blood ran cold. Mr. Tom, Thomas Reeves, had been their handyman 10 years ago, helping with odd jobs around the house. He had disappeared shortly after Daniel went missing, and the police had never been able to locate him for questioning. At the time, they'd assumed he'd simply moved on to another town, as traveling handymen often did. The photographs showed Daniel playing with a German Shepherd puppy, undeniably a younger Max, in what appeared to be a partially constructed wooden structure. Claire had never seen these photos before, had never known about this secret friendship. In the background of one photo, she caught a glimpse of something that made her gasp: a distinctive red door, just like the one in Daniel's drawing. Max whined softly, nudging the key that had fallen from the box. Claire picked it up, studying its antique design. It looked old, possibly belonging to one of the abandoned buildings in the industrial district where Max had been found, the same area where Daniel had vanished. As if reading her thoughts, Max began pawing at the photos, specifically at one that showed a partial street sign in the background. Claire held it under the patio light, squinting through tears. "Warehouse Row," she read aloud. Max's ears perked up, and he gave a soft bark of confirmation. Claire's mind raced. Warehouse Row was a street in the old industrial district, lined with abandoned storage facilities. She'd walked that street countless times during the initial search for Daniel, but the police had found nothing suspicious. Now she wondered, had they been looking in the wrong places? Had they missed something that only Max knew about? Standing up with sudden determination, Claire went inside to change clothes. This couldn't wait until morning. She'd spent 10 years wondering, grieving, imagining every possible scenario. Now she finally had real clues, and more importantly, she had Max, a living witness to whatever had happened to her son. As she dressed, her eyes fell on an old newspaper clipping she'd kept. "Local boy still missing, community loses hope." The article mentioned Thomas Reeves only briefly, noting that he'd been cleared of suspicion due to lack of evidence. Claire had always felt uneasy about that conclusion, but without any proof, she'd been forced to accept it. Max appeared in the doorway, carrying something else in his mouth, a torn piece of fabric that he'd apparently dug up along with the box. Claire recognized it immediately. It was from the jacket Daniel had been wearing the day he disappeared. She'd always assumed the police had collected all the evidence, but here was proof that they'd missed something crucial. "We're going to find him, aren't we?" Claire asked Max, who responded with a soft whimper and pressed his head against her hand. "You've been trying to get back to him all this time." As if in answer, Max walked to her bedside table and gently picked up Mr. Buttons again. This time, Claire noticed something she'd missed before, a tiny tear in the bare seam, different from the one that had hidden Daniel's drawing. Carefully, she widened the tear and reached inside, her fingers touching something metallic. She pulled out a small key ring with a tag attached. The tag was faded, but she could just make out the words. "Storage Unit 23, Warehouse Row." Below it was a name that confirmed her worst fears: Thomas Reeves. Thunder crashed outside as Claire grabbed her car keys, the pieces of the puzzle finally starting to form a clear picture. Max waited by the front door, his posture alert and ready. They both knew where they needed to go, but neither could have predicted the shocking truth they would uncover in that industrial district, a truth that had been waiting 10 years to be revealed. As they drove through the storm, Claire glanced at Max in the rearview mirror. His eyes were fixed ahead, focused on their destination with an intensity that suggested he'd been waiting for this moment since the day he'd been separated from Daniel. Whatever they found at Warehouse Row, Claire knew one thing for certain: Max hadn't just randomly wandered into that shelter 3 months ago. He'd been searching for someone who could help him finish what he'd started a decade ago, someone who could finally bring Daniel home. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour by the time Claire's car pulled onto Warehouse Row. The street looked different at night, more menacing, with shadows dancing across the weathered brick buildings in the sweep of her headlights. Max sat forward in the back seat, his entire body tense with anticipation. Claire parked in front of Unit 23, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tight her knuckles turned white. The storage unit looked abandoned like all the others, its rolling door covered in rust and graffiti. But something about it made her skin crawl, perhaps the way Max was now growling softly, his eyes fixed on the padlocked entrance. "Stay close to me," Claire whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was protecting Max or seeking protection from him. She pulled out the key ring they'd found in Mr. Button's, its metal cold against her palm. As they approached the unit, Max suddenly froze, his ears perking up. Claire heard it too, a faint sound coming from inside, like metal scraping against metal. Someone was there. Claire's heart pounded as she dialed 911 on her phone, keeping her finger hovering over the call button. With her other hand, she reached for the padlock, the key sliding in perfectly. The lock clicked open, and in that moment, Max's behavior changed dramatically. He lunged forward, pushing his body against the rolling door with unexpected force. The door rattled upward, and what Claire saw inside made her drop both the phone and the keys. The storage unit wasn't just a storage space, it was set up like a surveillance center. One wall was covered in monitors showing security camera feeds from various locations, including, to her horror, the outside of her house. Another wall displayed hundreds of photographs, Daniel through the years, from age 6 when he disappeared, progressively aging through computer generation. But it was the last photo that made her gasp, a real photograph, dated just 3 months ago, showing a teenage boy who unmistakably resembled her son. "He's alive!" Claire breathed, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. All this time. A sudden movement in the corner caught her attention. Max barked sharply, positioning himself between Claire and the shadowy figure that emerged. Thomas Reeves, aged but recognizable, his face twisted in a mixture of surprise and anger. "You weren't supposed to find this place," he snarled, reaching behind his back. "You were supposed to give up, like everyone else did." But before he could reveal what he was reaching for, Max sprang into action. Years of pent-up fury seemed to fuel his attack as he knocked Thomas to the ground, sending something clattering across the concrete floor, a gun. Claire kicked the weapon away, her fear transforming into rage. "Where is my son?" she demanded, her voice stronger than she thought possible. "The photo, it's recent. Where is Daniel?" Thomas laughed, a hollow sound that echoed through the unit. "You'll never find him. I've kept him safe all these years, protected him from the world's corruption. He's mine now, he doesn't even remember you." Max's growl deepened, his teeth dangerously close to Thomas's throat. The man's bravado faltered as he realized the dog remembered everything. "That mutt," Thomas spat. "I should have finished him when I had the chance. He was just a puppy when he found Daniel and me that day. Wouldn't stop following us. I tried to chase him away, but he kept coming back, watching us. That's why we had to keep moving." Claire's mind raced as she processed this information. "The clubhouse in the photos, it wasn't a clubhouse at all, was it? It was your first hiding place. Daniel trusted me," Thomas continued, his voice taking on a deranged quality. "I was more of a father to him than his real one ever was. I protected him from the divorce, from the custody battles, from everything that would have ruined him." Claire felt sick. Thomas had been their handyman during her divorce, had seen the toll it was taking on Daniel. Somehow, in his twisted mind, he'd appointed himself Daniel's protector. Max suddenly shifted his attention to one of the monitors, barking urgently. Claire followed his gaze and saw something that made her heart stop, a live feed showing a small room with a bed, books, and sitting on that bed, a teenage boy reading. That's not live," Thomas stuttered, but his face betrayed the truth. "That's an old recording, Claire was already moving, searching the unit for clues to the location. Max joined her, sniffing urgently until he found what they needed, a stack of mail addressed to a property just 2 blocks away. The sound of sirens filled the air. Someone must have heard the commotion and called the police. Thomas tried to take advantage of the distraction to escape, but Max was faster, pinning him down until the police cars pulled up outside. As officers swarmed the unit, Claire showed them the surveillance footage. Within minutes, a tactical team was assembled, and Claire found herself in the back of a police car racing toward the address they'd found, Max by her side, his mission nearly complete. The building was an old apartment complex, its windows dark except for one on the 3rd floor. As police surrounded the building, Claire caught a glimpse of movement behind that lit window, a shadow that made her heart recognize what her mind could hardly believe. After 10 years, she was finally about to see her son again. But Max's rigid posture and low growls suggested that this rescue wouldn't be as straightforward as they hoped. Something about the building's silence, the too-perfect setup, raised a red flag. As they approached the entrance, Max suddenly pulled Claire back. Just as a tripped wire caught the light, the building had been rigged. Thomas's final failsafe, Claire realized with horror. If he couldn't keep Daniel, he made sure nobody could reach him easily. The question now was, how would they get to her son without triggering whatever traps lay between them and that 3rd-floor window? Max's eyes met Claire's, and in them she saw the same determination that had brought them this far. Somehow, this extraordinary dog had not only remembered where Daniel was but had spent years trying to find his way back, waiting for the perfect moment to lead someone there. Now, on the brink of reunion, he seemed to be saying that he had one last task to complete, one final path to show them through the darkness. The bomb squad arrived within minutes, their equipment casting eerie shadows across the rain-slicked street. But Max's behavior had changed again. He was now focused intently on a narrow alley beside the building, his tail straight and alert. Claire recognized that look. He knew something they didn't. "Wait!" she called out to the tactical team preparing to approach the front entrance. Max found something. The police captain, a veteran named Martinez, had already witnessed enough of Max's extraordinary instincts to take him seriously. Following Max down the alley, they discovered what appeared to be a service entrance, partially hidden behind overgrown vines. Unlike the main entrance, this door showed signs of regular use, worn paint around the handle, recent footprints in the mud. "Thomas must have used this to come and go without being noticed," Claire whispered. Max confirmed her suspicion by pawing at the ground near the door, uncovering a loose brick that concealed another key. Captain Martinez radioed his team. "Possible clean entry point located. Stand by." He turned to Claire, his expression grave. "Mrs. Matthews, you need to stay here." I'm going in," Claire interrupted, her voice leaving no room for argument. "My son hasn't seen me in 10 years. If he's as confused as Thomas claimed, he needs a familiar face." She looked down at Max, who stood firmly by her side. "And he needs Max. They have a connection we're only beginning to understand." After a tense moment, Martinez nodded. "Stay behind us, and follow every instruction immediately." He spoke into his radio again. "Team 2, maintain position at front entrance. Team 1, converge on rear service door. Possible bypass of explosive triggers." The service door opened to a narrow stairwell, emergency lights casting a sickly green glow over everything. Max took the lead, moving with careful precision, stopping at each landing to sniff the air. The bomb squad technician followed with his detection equipment, but it was Max who seemed to sense the danger zones instinctively. On the 2nd floor, Max suddenly stopped, his hackles rising. The technician's equipment confirmed what the dog had already known. Tripwires crisscrossed the landing, connected to what appeared to be explosive charges. "Thomas was military before he became a handyman," Martinez muttered, studying the setup. "These are professional-grade devices." While the bomb squad worked to disarm the triggers, Claire noticed something odd about the wall, a section that didn't quite match the rest. Max was already pawing at it before she could point it out. Behind the loose panel, they found a stack of notebooks, Thomas's journals. Claire's hands trembled as she opened the most recent one, its pages filled with rambling justifications and increasingly paranoid thoughts. "Listen to this," she whispered, reading an entry dated just 1 week ago. Daniel's starting to ask questions I can't answer. The programming is wearing off. Sometimes he looks at old photographs like he's trying to remember. The dog's influence was stronger than I anticipated. Even after all these years, he still draws pictures of that damn German Shepherd. I should have eliminated the threat when I had the chance, but now it's too late. They're both loose ends that need to be tied up. The implications hit Claire like a physical blow. He was planning to finish them both, Daniel and Max. Max's whine drew their attention back to the stairs. They were approaching the 3rd floor, and his behavior was becoming increasingly agitated. When they reached the final landing, they understood why. The entire 3rd floor had been converted into what looked like a twisted version of a home. The walls were covered with educational posters and achievement certificates made out to Daniel Reeves. Thomas had been trying to erase Daniel's true identity, replacing it with a fictional one of his own creation. But it was the small details that broke Claire's heart. Crayon drawings hidden under the bed, all featuring the same brown dog, a makeshift calendar marking off days until something labeled "Final Move," and most chillingly, a recent photograph showing Daniel sleeping while hooked up to N4 drip. "He's been drugging him," the police medic confirmed, examining a cabinet full of pharmaceutical bottles. "Long-term sedation and memory-suppressing medications. The kind used in some psychiatric facilities." Claire felt the room spin, but Max's solid presence beside her kept her grounded. They could hear movement now from behind a locked door at the end of the hall. Someone was awake and moving around. Martinez positioned his team, then gave Claire a nod. She stepped forward, her heart thundering in her chest, and called out softly, "Daniel?" The movement inside stopped. Then, a hesitant voice, deeper than she remembered, but with an unmistakable familiar lilt. Who's there?" "Daniel, it's Mom. I'm here with Max." At the mention of Max's name, there was a crash from inside the room, followed by the sound of furniture being dragged. "Max? My Max?" The door burst open, and there stood Daniel, 16 now, tall and thin, his face a mixture of confusion and desperate hope. His eyes landed first on Claire, showing no recognition, but when he saw Max, something extraordinary happened. The German Shepherd approached slowly, tail wagging gently, and touched his nose to Daniel's hand. In that moment, Claire watched as a decade of chemical suppression and psychological manipulation began to crack. "You came back," Daniel whispered, falling to his knees beside Max. "You found me. I remember." He stopped, his face contorting in pain as memories fought against years of conditioning. "The clubhouse, it wasn't Mr. Tom, he..." Max pressed closer, whimpering softly, and Daniel buried his face in the dog's fur. When he looked up again, his eyes met Claire's, and this time, there was a flicker of recognition. "Mom?" His voice broke on the word, uncertain but hoping. "Mom, I think I remember. Max was trying to save me." Mr. Tom shot at him, but Max wouldn't leave. He kept coming back, trying to lead people to me, but Mr. Tom kept moving us. He made me forget, but Max never forgot. Claire took a step forward, her arms aching to hold her son, but before she could reach him, Max's posture suddenly changed. His ears flattened, and he spun toward the window, growling fiercely. Through the glass, they could see a red dot moving across the room, a sniper's laser sight. Thomas had one final backup plan. Time seemed to freeze as the red dot danced across the room. In that split second before chaos erupted, Max made a decision that would prove just how deep his loyalty ran. Without hesitation, he launched himself at Daniel, knocking him away from the window just as a bullet shattered the glass. "Get down!" Captain Martinez shouted, but Max was already herding both Claire and Daniel toward the hallway, his body positioned as a shield between them and the window. "He's on the roof of the building across the street," a tactical officer reported through the radio. "Teams moving to intercept." But Claire knew Thomas wouldn't be caught easily. He'd had 10 years to plan for this moment. Her suspicion was confirmed when multiple red dots appeared through different windows, sweeping the room in a deadly dance. He's using automated targeting systems, Martinez realized. Remote-controlled rifles mounted at different positions. Daniel, still processing the shock of his returning memories, grabbed Max's fur with trembling hands. "The basement," he said suddenly, his voice stronger. "There's a tunnel. That's how he always moved me when people got too close. But Max found it once. That's why Mr. Tom tried to." His voice trailed off as more memories surfaced. Claire could see the pain in his eyes as years of suppressed trauma fought to break free. Max whined softly, touching his nose to Daniel's hand, and somehow that simple gesture seemed to anchor him. "We need to get out of here," Claire said, looking to Martinez for direction. But before the captain could respond, the building's fire alarm began blaring, and a familiar voice crackled through the emergency speakers. "Did you think I wouldn't have a contingency plan?" Thomas's voice was eerily calm. 10 years of work, of molding Daniel into something pure, something untainted by the world's corruption. I won't let you undo everything I've accomplished." The sound of multiple locks engaging echoed through the building, followed by the hiss of gas being released through the ventilation system. "You have 2 choices," Thomas continued. "Try to escape and face my security measures, or stay and succumb to the gas. Either way, my life's work ends on my terms." But Thomas had overlooked something crucial: Max's extraordinary intelligence and memory. The German Shepherd was already moving, guiding them not toward the basement as Thomas might have expected, but toward what appeared to be a solid wall. Daniel's eyes widened in recognition. "The dumbwaiter! I used to hide there when the memories got too strong, when I started to remember Mom. Mr. Tom never knew about it." Behind a false panel, they found the old dumbwaiter shaft, large enough for them to climb down one at a time. As Martinez coordinated with his team through the radio, Max kept watch, his keen senses alert for any new threats. They could hear gunfire outside as the police engaged with Thomas's automated weapons. The gas was getting thicker, making their eyes water and throats burn. They had minutes at most. "Daniel first," Claire insisted, helping her son into the shaft. But as she turned to follow, Max suddenly barked in alarm. Through the thickening gas, they saw one last red dot appear, aimed directly at Claire's heart. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Max leaped, not to knock Claire aside, but to catch the bullet meant for her. The impact threw him against the wall, blood staining his gray-flecked fur. "Max!" Daniel screamed, his voice breaking through years of enforced silence. The sound seemed to trigger something in him, a final shattering of Thomas's psychological walls. In that moment of clarity, all his memories came flooding back. "Mom!" he sobbed, reaching for Claire. "I remember everything. The day Mr. Tom took me, Max tried to stop him. He bit Mr. Tom's hand when he pulled out the needle, but he was just a puppy then. Mr. Tom kicked him so hard. I thought he was dead. But he wasn't. He kept finding us, every time we moved. That's why Mr. Tom started drugging me more, making me forget. But Max never gave up." Claire helped Martinez lift Max's wounded body, her tears mixing with the blood on his fur. The dog's eyes remained alert despite his injury, still focused on his mission to protect his family. As they made their way down the dumbwaiter shaft, they could hear chaos erupting above. Thomas's voice came through the speakers one last time, more deranged than ever. "If I can't have him, no one." The rest was cut off by the sound of an explosion. Thomas's final act had been to trigger the building's demolition charges, but he'd underestimated the police team's efficiency. They'd already located and disarmed the main explosives, leaving only small devices that shook the building but couldn't bring it down. When they finally emerged from the building, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Emergency vehicles lit up the night with flashing lights, and in their glow, they saw Thomas being led away in handcuffs. He'd been caught trying to escape through his own tunnel system. But no one was paying attention to Thomas anymore. All eyes were on the remarkable reunion unfolding in the back of an ambulance, where a veterinarian worked to save Max's life while Daniel held his head in his lap, whispering words of gratitude and love. "The bullet missed his vital organs," the vet announced after what seemed like hours. "He's going to need surgery and rehabilitation, but he's going to make it." Max's tail thumped weakly against the ambulance floor, and he managed to lift his head enough to lick Daniel's hand. The gesture seemed to say that even if he had to do it all over again, he would make the same choice. 3 months later, Claire stood in her backyard, watching Daniel and Max play fetch, something they'd been doing every day since returning home. The physical wounds had healed, though both Daniel and Max bore scars from their ordeal. The psychological healing would take longer, but they faced it together. Daniel was catching up on his education, showing a remarkable resilience and intelligence that even years of drugging couldn't suppress. He still struggled with nightmares, but Max seemed to sense them coming and would wake him before they got too bad, staying by his side until morning. "You know what I remember most clearly?" Daniel said one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Even when I couldn't remember who I was, even when Mr. Tom had convinced me you weren't real, Mom, I never forgot Max. It was like his love was too pure for the drugs to erase." Claire watched as Max rested his head on Daniel's knee, those intelligent eyes still ever watchful, ever protective. The German Shepherd had not only remembered his promise to a 6-year-old boy for 10 years, but had never stopped trying to fulfill it. He'd survived being shot as a puppy, endured years of searching, and taken another bullet at the end, all to bring his family back together. "Some people say animals can't feel love the way humans do," Claire said, reaching out to scratch Max's ears. "But I think sometimes they feel it even more purely. Max didn't just remember you, Daniel. He remembered what family means, what love means, better than most humans ever could." Max's tail wagged at her words, and he lifted his head to look between them, his expression somehow both wise and joyful. In that moment, as the last light of day painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, they were more than just a family reunited. They were a testament to the extraordinary power of a love that refused to forget, refused to give up, and refused to be broken by time or distance, or even the darkest of human intentions. Daniel hugged Max close, and for the first time since his rescue, he laughed, a sound of pure, unbridled joy that seemed to wash away the last shadows of his ordeal. "You came back," he whispered into Max's fur, echoing his first words of recognition. "You came back, and you brought me home." Max's response was simple but profound, a gentle lick, a soft whimper, and eyes that seemed to say, "I always will."